On this special edition of the Sky News Daily podcast, we take a look back at some of the stories that shaped 2022 and how they might shape our lives in future. Over 5, count 'em, special episodes, we'll be covering politics, international affairs, economics, climate change. But today we're looking at the royal family, the end of the second Elizabethan era, what can be expected from the reign of King Charles, and do you know what, we might have to mention Harry and Meghan as well. As you can see, we're joined by royal correspondent Rhiannon Mills.
Hi, Neil.
Lovely to see you. Before we get into the long grass and all of this, have you ever known a year on the royal beat like it?
Do you know what, the last 3 years have been quite extraordinary. The death of Prince Philip, everything that's happened with the Sussexes, the stories around Prince Andrew. It's been a roller coaster over 3 years, really. But I think at the start of every year, the royal family, they always have their calendar drilled down. So you know kind of the big events that are going to happen. And I think this was going to be a year where things were meant to get back to normal because we didn't have the restrictions of COVID. So we thought they'd be back out and about again doing tours. But yeah, the stories, the events that unfolded, many of us just could not predict, and it's been extraordinary.
Well, let's start with the Jubilee, Platinum Jubilee. I mean, just in terms of being in a job for any length of time. I mean, Her Majesty was, from the moment that she acceded to the throne. I mean, she did say she was going to devote her life to public service, never back away from it, and she didn't. Absolutely.
At the start of the year, because obviously the Platinum Jubilee actually started in February with Accession Day, so the moment that her father died. And that's always a slightly, obviously, tricky time because she's obviously wanted to kind of pay respects to her father, but that's where the kind of celebratory feel kind of began. And at that time, it felt fairly low-key, as it always does around Accession Day. But I kept saying to people, look, we need to remember that this is the only monarch who has ever achieved 70 years on the throne. This is quite a remarkable legacy. It's a remarkable feat that she's achieved. But I think right from that Accession Day moment, it felt like the Queen was going to use this year to future-proof the rest of the institution and emphasise that this wasn't just about her, because I think that was the extraordinary thing about the Queen. This was never about her own ego or her own kind of personal fulfilment. This was about carrying out a role and protecting an institution that she was born into. And so from Accession Day, you might remember that Accession Day message where literally kind of the WhatsApp group blew up, like that we have with all the royal correspondents in the palace, when there was that message saying, yeah, I want Camilla to be Queen Consort. And we're like, wow, where's this come from?
Was there then a feeling, because even back then there were signs of the old age beginning to catch up with her, and of course the loss of her husband was a big factor in that as well. But was there already at that point in the year the beginnings of a feeling of the handing of the torch?
I think we've had that for a few years.
Sure.
So, for example, with Remembrance Sunday, for a few years now, the now King has placed the Queen's wreath on behalf of the nation. So that's kind of very subtly been happening. But now, I think this year, no one was afraid to really talk about it.
I mean, she was working all the way to the end, of course. That photo of the Queen meeting the briefly Prime Minister Liz Truss, but even then there were signs, physical signs, that perhaps things were not all great.
Yeah. I think if we go back to the Platinum Jubilee, that weekend there was so much chat about how much exactly we'd see the Queen, and she knew that the crowds had come out to see her, and so we had it's unbelievable, isn't it, to think it was this 4-day event, this 4-day celebration. On the Thursday we had the Trooping the Colour. She made 2 balcony appearances. The crowd went mad when they saw her, but after Thursday, we then thought that she was going to go to a service at St Paul's on the Friday. She wasn't well enough to do that. We were told that she needed to rest. She'd also kind of started off some beacon lighting on the Thursday night. And that again was that sense of, do you know what, she is obviously trying to really rally herself to do this. But also you can't forget that we've got to talk about Paddington Bear. Can't not talk about Paddington Bear.
Go on then.
My goodness. Before we get into more sombre times, excuse the name dropping, but I was backstage at the Platinum Jubilee concert with the likes of, I don't know, Rod Stewart, Queen, Andrea Bocelli, Jason Donovan.
Jason Donovan,
absolutely,
the highlight there,
the big names. And I didn't get to watch this concert go out. And then all of a sudden on Twitter, everyone's going mad about this Paddington Bear moment. And I watched it, and look, I can be a bit of a softie. I watched it, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is heartwarming. And then you think, was it a deep fake? Was it one of these like deep fake queens? And it wasn't. She had decided that for her Platinum Jubilee, she was again going to completely catch us all out, and I just think it was her amazing sense of humour, really. And actually, the family didn't know about it. I asked Camilla about it on the flight back from Rwanda after the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. I was like, "Did you know it was coming?" She said, "No, we didn't know it was coming." So yeah.
But we have to talk about the end.
So I was in our offices that are in the centre of London, and I remember, I thought it was going to be a quiet morning. I remember the message coming through from the palace around lunchtime, 12:30, saying that doctors were concerned about the Queen's health, and then it was the next bit that really set the alarm bells ringing for me, that the family were making their way up to Balmoral, and it was, I think it caught us all by surprise. On the Tuesday, so just a couple of days before, I'd been in the rain in Balmoral. The Queen had kind of been doing that handover of from one Prime Minister to the next, carried out that really important constitutional role. And then on the Wednesday night, we'd been told that she was unwell, so couldn't carry out a Privy Council meeting. But that wasn't that unexpected, because those things were kind of happening quite regularly. Then Thursday, this comes through. And it was the fact that doctors were concerned about her health, the family were heading in that direction to Balmoral. It felt, look, for the 8 years that I've done the job, it just felt completely out of kilter from what you would normally get from the royal family. And then, as the afternoon went on, I have to say, Westminster went into a complete meltdown of rumours. And it was, and when you're reporting on a story like that, look, you want to be accurate. There are no prizes for getting this one wrong. And so it was trying to stay calm, but keep people informed when there is kind of a vacuum of information, and that's quite difficult. And then, we were sort of alerted a couple of minutes before it was then announced via email and the royal family website. We knew that would go black and that there would be some kind of announcement put on there. And it was 6:30. But throughout the afternoon, it was just this constant rumour mill of she's died and no one's reporting it. For me, they were never going to make that announcement until the family were there in Scotland. And most of the family were there. Harry wasn't.
I don't want us to dwell too long on what happened next, because frankly, the country did have 10 days of national mourning in the middle of, a cost of living crisis, which some people, did say was perhaps on the excessive side. We had the funeral. I mean, what were your thoughts about that? I don't think we'll ever see that again.
No, I don't. And look, 8 years I've carried round a book of note, a black book of notes, sort of waiting for this moment. And I've always known the choreography of what was going to happen over that 10 days. And I was very clear in my mind, which I don't think some people were, that the moment that the Queen took her last breath, we immediately had a new king. And for me, it was always going to be fascinating to watch how the palace handled that immense outpouring of grief and people wanting to mourn the death of a woman that they clearly loved very much. Some people not really sure why they felt that connection because they'd never met her, but really wanted to mark that moment. And then you kind of mix that with the trumpets on Friary Court at St James's welcoming a new king. How do you get the balance right between those two emotions? And actually, I think the palace, they played it perfectly. But also, I was within the planning. There were plans for these huge queues of people to come and see the Queen lying in state, and I was thinking, really, is that going to happen? This isn't the 1950s. This isn't when her father died. We live in a much less deferential age. Would people really come out? And And they really did.
They did, but I will, just to play a devil's advocate here,
Yeah.
as a statistically significant share of the overall population, the queues at Westminster were not, I'm afraid.
I still think there is something to take away from the fact that some people were queuing for 15 hours.
Well, some people, others who
Not everybody.
others who work in our industry perhaps jump the queue. But
Yeah.
but that does give us an opportunity to kind of talk about the next stage, the end of the second Elizabethan era. We now have our new king, King Charles. He will be crowned next year. But what are his priorities? I mean, what are we learning about the way in which his royal household might be different from that of his mother?
Look, we can't get away from the fact that not everyone has always warmed to the idea of having a King Charles. And actually I thought there would be more protest and more complaint about, well, hang on a minute, we don't get to choose this man. Why does he just step into that role? And there hasn't been. And actually I think what's happened kind of down the road from Buckingham Palace at number 10 has kind of been quite helpful, really.
Yeah.
At a time when you've got prime ministers coming and going, a man who has been heir for 70 years actually feels like a sense of continuity in some ways. And I've been out and about with him, various engagements up and down the country, and what's been really striking is how people, they want to touch him. Like
Sorry, what do you mean? Sorry, what,
it's really
literally?
peculiar, yes, really peculiar, in a way that we never would have seen with the Queen. They're touching his hand, they're kissing him, they're stroking his arm.
He must be encouraging it at the very least.
Well, he's very close.
Yeah.
He's very close, and and there's this warmth, and I think people are connecting with that. Look, you can't get away from the criticisms that the royal family have faced recently, and for example, the domestic violence reception that was held at Buckingham Palace, and then the racism allegations that came out of that. You have a new reign which is starting in a completely different phase of life, and people's opinions are much more polarised than the start of the Queen's reign. But that's what he's jumping into.
There is a constant, though, isn't it? And it is Camilla. I mean, how important has she been? How important will she be to his reign, which, of course, will not be as long as his mother?
Yeah, hugely important. And it's amazing, isn't it, really, to think that this is a woman who was widely hated, ostracised, held up as kind of the woman that drove Diana away. Actually, when you watch them together, they're a brilliant team. They are a brilliant working team. She does soften him. They do laugh a lot together. And I think, especially during that time after the Queen died, she was, remember one of the pen incidents where he was filmed shouting at this pen because it was leaking, and it was Camilla who was there trying to calm down the situation. And I think that's definitely what she does for him. But also she's been very clear on her wanting to do this work around domestic violence and use her platform, and has been able to kind of come out and be more outspoken about that.
But we are also already seeing signs of the next handover. William and Kate have been so much more prominent, although, they have had a couple of dodgy missteps over the past 12 months.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, the Caribbean tour. Like, my goodness, that seems like years ago, but no, that was the start of this year, where they went on this Caribbean tour to Belize, Jamaica and the Bahamas. And many came away from it saying that was an absolute disaster. I'm not sure it was the complete disaster that everyone portrayed it as. Actually, I was there, interviewed various people in all of those countries, and no, there weren't wall-to-wall protests, but it did show that we are in a new era, and when it comes to addressing those issues around diversity, inclusivity, racism, that is what they are. They are sort of wading into now, and they can't avoid it. And I don't think they are trying to avoid it, really. I think the king, like in the days after the Queen died, he had this meeting of multi-faith leaders where he said how diversity is one of the things that he sees as his key role to promote. and also his address to the nation. It felt very inclusive. But can they connect? It's tricky.
Let's both be fair. If they are to modernise the monarchy, there is a big task ahead of them, and indeed that will be something that we will be discussing after the break, viewed through the prism of, guess who? Harry and Meghan. Welcome back to this special edition of the Sky News Daily Podcast. Our royal correspondent, Rhiannon Mills, is here taking us through 2022 for the House of Windsor. And look, I wonder if you can just remind us, what was the Susan Hussey incident? Because it plays into what we're about to talk to the Harry and Meghan documentary series.
Yeah. So you had a domestic violence reception at Buckingham Palace, which was being billed as a massive moment for Camilla, who we know has been so passionate about this cause. She had invited kind of leading voices in that space, and yet a couple of days later it was completely overshadowed by the fact that one of those domestic violence campaigners claimed that she had been approached by a lady in waiting or a member of the royal household and been questioned about her ethnicity. It absolutely blew up, understandably, completely blew up for them. And what I think was most telling was how quickly the palace responded.
And specifically, I mean, William, this was his godmother, wasn't it? I mean, he called it, I can't remember the phraseology he used, but it was basically along the lines of, this is abhorrent.
You have to put it in the context. They were flying to America for their first overseas trip for a while. They're first to America since 2014 and for his Earthshot Prize. So from a strategic perspective, trying to shut down that story was obviously going to be very important. But his spokesperson was kind of making it very clear that he did not accept what had happened. This was wrong, and was going to call that out. And for me, that was what was so striking about that incident, was I think in the past, under the Queen, we would not necessarily have seen them deal with it with the speed at which they did.
But wasn't the speed in part, or in large part, because, in essence, it confirmed that which Meghan Markle had said in that interview to Oprah Winfrey, that there was racism in the royal household.
Yeah, and that was so toxic when Meghan made those allegations about the royal family, and it's hung over them. It's hung over everything that they've done.
Well, it's been repeated in the documentary, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's been repeated in the documentary. When William and Kate went to the Caribbean, it was being used then for people who were saying, oh, they don't get it. They don't get the issue around slavery. Oh, and Meghan would know that because she says they're racist. I think they had to. It was out of necessity. However, if the Queen was still around, would we have seen them react with that speed? I'm not sure that we would have done, because Susan Hussey had been her sort of devoted lady in waiting for a very long time. Now the palace are delighted that both parties have got together and have had this meaningful discussion. Should have happened in the first place? No. Have the palace been enough on the front foot to tell us what they are doing when it comes to addressing those issues internally? Not necessarily.
But just in terms, though, of the negative impact that the documentary clearly has had, and the kind of the more detailed allegations that emerged in the latest, the later episodes, I do wonder, I mean, is there a relationship that is capable of being saved? I'm not just talking about Charles and Harry, but William and Harry. I mean, they're brothers, for goodness sakes.
Look, just watching the 6 hours, it felt exhausting. It felt exhausting, and I just came away from it thinking, yes, okay, financially they've done very well out of it, but I don't really know what Harry and Meghan have necessarily achieved from it.
Really?
No, because they have always been such divisive figures anyway. Some people love them, other people despise them. Will it have shifted the dial for anyone on that spectrum? I don't think so. I think it's just ramped up both sides. Like I see it every time I write anything about this story.
Yeah.
The level of abuse that I get is off the charts compared to anything else that I write about when it comes to the royal family. Why did Harry... I wrote the other day, Harry, it feels like he is a prince who, in telling his side of the fairy tale, has basically fed the beast that he is trying to slay. He has fed the tabloid press with all the stories that they wanted about him falling out with William, about him falling out with his father. I don't know why he had to go in that direction.
But I completely hear you. I completely get it. Do you then think that Buckingham Palace, Charles, that for 2023, dealing with Harry and Meghan, you know, perhaps bringing them back into the fold, that is anywhere close to a priority for them? I mean, what are they looking to do in 2023, apart from ensure that Andrew never gives another interview?
I think they'll want to guarantee that for a very long time. Look, you've got the coronation coming up. So already people are talking about, will they get an invitation to the coronation or not?
I'll get an invite to my wedding, I'll tell you that.
I think if you look at the Queen's funeral, and also all the way back to Prince Philip's funeral as well, and I've spoken to people within the palace, this is why there's a sense of weariness and also a sense of sadness. I suspect, there probably is a sense of anger as well. They've done this Netflix series. Efforts were made to make them feel included around the Queen's death. Charles, in his address to the nation, talked about the Queen's unerring ability to see the good in everyone. And that week around her death, it felt like they were saying, look, we're going to put everything to one side and we're all going to be a united front as a family. And then Harry and Meghan have done this. And I think there is a sense of sadness about it. But also, someone at the palace said to me the other day, in some ways, the family are now being guided by a mantra that the Queen was always guided by, which was, don't look at your feet, look to the horizon. And
the problem with that is what is coming over the horizon? Harry's book.
Yeah, in January.
Why do I get the impression, Rhiannon, that 2023 is going to be a very, very busy year for you? Look, thank you so much for taking us through 2022. And of course, any number of those little individual stories that Rhiannon and I have been covering, we have covered on the podcast. You can listen to those where you discovered this one. Also, at the same time, our other end-of-year podcasts on economics, politics, the climate change, and everything else. You can find those as well. But from Rhiannon and me, thanks for joining us.